Myth number one, we are not a democracy. A democracy inherently means the centralization of power. A constitutional republic respects the decentralization of powers. The Founding Fathers wrote in the Federalist Papers that the Electoral College will be the greatest hedge against the tyranny of the mob.
So this question is, I've actually sent a letter to Ben Shapiro, to Mark Dice. This is kind of an open question. I'm always in conflict. It's dealing with the Electoral College.
Sure.
And based upon, if you look at the for me, I'm kind of like, okay, I do the numbers. I say, let's say I'm in New York or I'm in California. My vote is only worth 0.7. If I go to Wyoming, my vote is worth 1.4. In comparison, someone who's residing in California to someone who's in Wyoming, there is quite a difference. But at the same time, I think people in Wyoming should have a voice versus only as not just being some mass or densely populated areas telling me what my voice should be. If I've started really thinking about, okay, if the Electoral College is good, then why don't we apply the Electoral College within states? Like, for example, it's like, I kind of like said, if we look at, so for example, the state of Washington.
So, right, so every state has the freedom to choose to appropriate their electors however they see fit.
Right.
So that's a misunderstood notion about the Electoral College. So if the state of Washington actually wants to put their electors based on the popular vote, they have that freedom. And so that's a way to reverse engineer the Electoral College. I wouldn't support that. Let me tell you why I support the Electoral College. First and foremost, myth number one, we are not a democracy. Nor should we. Nor should we be.
So I'm here to be educated.
No, I know. I'm not trying to. I'm just walking you through.
So explain that last statement, because I want to understand that.
Okay.
Totally
So
kind of
that's okay. So we are a constitutional republic with a democrat mechanism to put people in power. Now, what's the difference? A true pure democracy, as Bernie Sanders would want it, and he has argued for it, using him as an example, 51% of the population can vote your rights away. So if 51% of the population believes something, all of a sudden your Second Amendment rights could disappear. In the current system, that's not the way it works. In order to get rid of something that is enumerated as a right, you have to go through 3/5 of the states. You have to go through a huge amount of mechanisms. It's not a direct democracy. Secondly, a democracy lends itself to mob rule. And so a country that is a direct democracy that is purely populist and purely on what a vast majority of people want lends itself to who can promise the most amount of free stuff to the population. The Founding Fathers talked about this in the Federalist Papers. They said we never want to create a country where it's going to be a race of who can redistribute the most amount of stuff back to the citizens. The final thing, and this is so important, a democracy inherently means the centralization of power. A constitutional republic respects the decentralization of power. So a great example is something that I think gravitated power away from the people is when we instituted the direct election of senators. So senators used to be held accountable to the state legislatures. So these were not political positions, believe it or not. They were not people that were trying to make themselves into national political icons, but they were held accountable to the state legislature, which were very, very held accountable to the people. And they were recalled all the time. They'd say, this senator is not representing our state's interests. So now you see these senators, and both parties, by the way, both parties do this, from Marco Rubio to Elizabeth Warren, that use their U.S. Senate seat to try to do national fundraising campaigns and try to turn themselves into national celebrities, instead of being in what the Founding Fathers wanted to be, which was an employee of the state government.
Right.
So it eroded states' rights. Here's the final thing. From a pragmatic standpoint, the Electoral College requires candidates to go to parts of the country that they otherwise would completely and totally ignore. And so if you look at the math, Hillary Clinton could have lost 65% of what we call middle America and won 80% of Los Angeles and 80% of New York, and she would have been president.
Right.
And so what the Electoral College requires is a unique complexion and a very diverse sample size of the American electorate. So in order to be president, you have to have a message that resonates from Miami, Florida, to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to New Hampshire. And so if If we had a direct democracy, you would see a hyper-focus on the media markets of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Miami, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, which would hyper-polarize in a country that would further divide us. And I would compellingly make that argument. But I think it's important that, for the Electoral College standpoint, it reinforces the idea of states' rights, that the state matters. And it works both ways. So the Democrats like to say this is something that only benefits Republicans. It's not. Look at Rhode Island. Rhode Island's a very small state, and there's 3 electoral votes for Rhode Island. You look at Vermont. So there's states that are very small and very liberal that benefit from the Electoral College just as much as the existence of North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, or Montana. And so I can go further and further into it, but finally, the Founding Fathers wrote in the Federalist Papers that the Electoral College will be the greatest hedge against the tyranny of the mob. And I encourage you to look at it.
So to close on that,
To
close on that. So
very thoughtful question, by the way.
So to close on that, many of those and the Democrats who are running for positions this coming November have put on the ballot to do away of this old stodgy thing called the Electoral College, and they feel it no longer represents them. So I feel that is something to fear of, especially those in the flyover states. And I'm looking. How could they do that? Could they actually say we're going to get rid of it?
It's going to be nearly impossible. The way that Democrats will diminish the power of the Electoral College is what, I'm not sure if Washington has done this, but I know Connecticut is entertaining it. Where essentially they would say that Connecticut decides, or Washington decides, to appropriate their electors based on the winner of the national popular vote. Okay, so there we go. Thank you. And so that's the way that if liberals want to use the electoral process, they can use it through that state-driven way. I wouldn't vote for that if it was a ballot referendum, but I also constitutionally, there's nothing to prevent them from doing it. But the interesting thing is every state can do it differently. So Maine, for example, does it by congressional district. So Trump won 1 electoral vote in the state of Maine because he won the central part of Maine, which is very union, very industrialized. Barack Obama won 1 electoral vote in the state of Nebraska, where Omaha is. So Omaha and Maine are the only 2 states in the country that appropriate their electors based on congressional district. And this is kind of the reinforces states' rights, is that shouldn't each state be able to go to the people and say, how do you want to be represented? Maybe you want to divide it up. Maybe you don't want to go all in or all for nothing. And as soon as you go to this direct style democracy, you can go through the arguments I made earlier. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.